one of the reasons I come back to this conference year after year is to listen to Jonathan introduce me. I've arranged this year for a souvenir DVD of the introduction to be available on sale in the lobby. I'm a last-minute addition, actually, to the program in this particular slot. And for those who aren't keeping up with the changes in the agenda, I am not General Gantz, and I'm not running for political office in Israel. Actually, General Gantz and I do have a number of things in common. We're both former soldiers. We both served in the infantry. We're both former paratroopers. We both went through Special Forces training at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. There are a few differences. One is rank. He's Lieutenant General. I was a captain, a mere 6 degrees of difference. And there is a difference in age. Turns out, coincidentally, I was commissioned on General Gantz's birthday. I was 19. He was 3 at the time. I do want to thank Boaz Ganor and Stevie Weinberg for bringing me back again. This is always an extraordinary assembly of experience and expertise on this particular topic. There are lots of conferences on terrorism. This is not only the best, I regard this as the essential meeting on terrorism, bringing together people from all over the globe. I noticed this time this small video that is running about enough. It's a terrific message, but in just watching it, if you just turn off the sound for a minute and just look at it, you see, of course, this staccato display of flashing images, and actually that is very much the way we tend to see terrorism, particularly members of the public. Our perceptions are driven by the latest headlines and our frame for viewing the most recent atrocity, the random act of violence, massacre of innocents, tends to be a very narrow one. How did this happen? Was there a failure of intelligence or a failure of security? What must be done to prevent this from ever happening again? And while that's entirely sensible, it sometimes causes us to lose our broader historical perspective. And so today what I would like to do is to very briefly reflect on the evolution beneath the headlines, some of the larger developments in terrorism that we've seen over the last half century. So here we go, 50 years and 15 minutes. It was 50 years ago this month that urban guerrillas in Brazil kidnapped the American ambassador. That particular event set off a wave of terrorist kidnappings. By the end of the 70s, terrorists had kidnapped more than 130 diplomats. They expanded their targets to include executives of corporations. Kidnapping became a principal way in which groups can attract attention to themselves and their causes, exert leverage over governments in crisis, and obtain ransoms to fund their operations. It has continued to be a problem that we deal with. It was a year before that incident that we saw the first terrorist hijacking, not the first hijacking, but the first terrorist hijacking of a commercial airliner, an El Al airliner. It was also the last hijacking of an El Al airliner. Hijackings proliferated after that until we were obliged to put in extraordinary security measures and gradually drive it down, but not fast enough to prevent a 9/11. It was in the following year, 1970, that we saw the first sabotage of a commercial airliner by terrorists, a Swiss Air flight. And again, that tactic proliferated. What we didn't fully realize at the time is that these were the opening salvos in what became a new mode of international conflict as terrorists really reflecting political circumstances and technological developments began to develop this new mode of warfare. One of the first major developments was the diffusion of terrorist tactics quickly throughout the world as terrorist groups in one part of the world inspired terrorists in another part of the world to imitate their tactics, as terrorists launched attacks abroad themselves, or as terrorist organizations contacted one another and created alliances. My good friend Eli Carmon has written about a number of these between the groups in Western Europe, for example, and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. So that was the first development. The second one was the standardization, if I can use that term, of the terrorist tactical repertoire. Very, very quickly it settled into bombings, assassinations, armed assaults, almost always on civilian targets, and kidnappings, hijackings, and other types of hostage situations. That was really well in place by the mid-1970s. Since then, we have seen innovations in terrorist tactics, but these have tended to be gradual and incremental. The third major development was the escalation in terrorism and in the level of terrorist violence. You know, if we look back, the worst incidents of terrorism in the 1970s resulted in tens of fatalities. For example, in 1972, the Lord Airport Massacre, 30 were killed. In the 1980s, this ascended to incidents with hundreds of fatalities. In part, this was a reflection of the necessity of terrorists to escalate their violence in order to stay in the headlines, but it was also a reflection of how ideologies derived from religion, which defined the terrorist constituency as God, as opposed to the more secular ideologies, took over. And so, as I say, in the 1980s, incidents with hundreds of fatalities became common. That became even more common in the 1990s. And on September 11th, 2001, we crossed into the thousands. Now, this was in tens, hundreds, thousands, an order of magnitude increase every 15 years. And it led the analysts to extrapolate from 9/11 future terrorist scenarios in which tens of thousands, or potentially even hundreds of thousands, would be killed. Instead of this continued vertical escalation, what we got instead what might be called horizontal escalation. That is, that as we pounded on the terrorist organizations, they decentralized, they became more dependent on their affiliates, and even more dependent on so-called homegrown terrorists. The next development really was the emergence of global terrorist enterprises. And I mean, if anything underscored that, it was the previous set of presentations talking about Al-Qaeda and ISIS. These are now worldwide operations. That wasn't necessarily new in terms of ideology. Certainly, we had seen previously ideologies that had global ambitions, anarchists in the late 19th century, that was a global movement, socialist revolutionaries at the beginning of the 20th century, fascism, and again, ideologies derived from religion, all had universal pretensions, but not with the ability to really coordinate and direct a global struggle. And that was a result of a technological change. In the late 1970s, as part of our research, we looked at weapons coming into the arsenals of armies that terrorists might acquire and adapt to their causes. For example, shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles to bring down civilian airliners. In doing so, however, we missed the most important development of all, the most important weapon. And that was the internet, then still in its infancy. But that really enabled these organizations to create an active global enterprise. It also fundamentally changed how terrorists are recruited. Terrorists joining, would-be warriors that joined a terrorist organization in the 1970s were essentially going underground into a clandestine organization, and they were carefully vetted in order to preclude bringing in infiltrators or unreliable operatives. That changed to recruitment by exhortation, in which one urges followers abroad to do whatever they can wherever they are. There's no vetting because there's no risk to the organization. It's low yield ore, but those who do something are then applauded and embraced by the terrorist organization. And that, in turn, had a profound effect on terrorist tactics, and it pushed us toward what might be called pure terrorism. These individual actors who were responding to these exhortations were either lone operators, single individuals, or tiny conspiracies. They had limited resources. They had limited access to weapons and could only go after the easiest targets. So it turns out to be a shooting, stabbings, driving an automobile into a group of people. And we've seen a lot of those in Israel and around the world now. In fact, the trajectory of car ramming attacks is paralleling that of airline hijacking in the early 1970s. It becomes, in a sense, a form of pure terrorism in the sense that it simply kill anybody anywhere in order to rack up a body count and make a point. It also had an effect, this remote recruiting, in terms of creating really a population of self-selecting attackers. Ideology for many of them has become less important. The attraction is often, in many cases, violence itself, just the attraction of violence. And an increasing number of those who respond have histories of aggression, criminal records, problems with mental instability. And there is really no bright, shining line between the terrorist and the mentally unstable anymore. And that, in turn, is pushing us toward really a new mode of activity, and that is autonomous action by untethered terrorists. Now, what do I mean by that? We are seeing really the atomization of violence. Terrorists without necessarily terrorist groups, who it's beyond leaderless resistance. It just becomes a kind of a terrorist activity that is driven by terrorist activity that is in turn inspired by terrorist activity. And that's taking us towards something we might even call the global tournament of terror, in which disconnected individuals, in some cases propelled by ideology, in many cases by personal grievances, inspired by other attacks, carry out attacks in kind of a contest. This is something like knights errant of the Middle Ages, but without medieval chivalry. Rather than mortal combat, it is simply killing civilians to rack up a score that will exceed the previous score. And then we come finally to what I think is the final development in this, and that is, now I know what that damn ringing is. You know, I've been sitting in the audience. I was like, what the hell is that noise? Well, there it is. I'm at time limit. Well, terrorism has become normalized. You know, when we first were dealing with this in the early 70s, the idea was we have to prevent terrorism from becoming an accepted mode of conflict. This cannot become the norm. In fact, it has. And I don't mean that our values have changed, and I don't mean that terrorism is condoned. It is just now that we realize and have to anticipate that as a complement to war, as a substitute to war, terrorism will continue. We can destroy terrorist organizations, but without any illusions that we will eliminate terrorism as a mode of political expression, as a mode of political conflict. And again, that was made so clear in the presentations that we've seen thus far in terms of how we deal with the aftermath of what in fact would be victories. There are victories elusive here. This thing simply goes on. We are in a realm of endless warfare punctuated by wars. And that is a major challenge. So even as we look at these latest developments, I can already see the outlines of next year's agenda for the summit. We'll be back. Thank you.